now be in the book, the first book of Augustine, The City of God Against the Pagans. It was edited by R.W. Dyson, and we're in book 1, and I entitled this Book 1, Part 1. Okay, so here we go. Preface. The plan and argument of the work here undertaken. Most glorious is the city of God, whether in this passing age, where she dwells by faith as a pilgrim among the ungodly, or in the security of that eternal home which she now patiently awaits until righteousness shall return unto judgment, but which she will then possess perfectly in final victory and perfect peace. In this work, O Marcellinus, most beloved son, due to you, by my promise, I have undertaken to defend her against those who favor their own gods, small g, above her founder. The work is great and arduous, but God is our helper. I know, however, what efforts are needed to persuade the proud how great is that virtue of humility which, not by dint of any human loftiness, but by divine grace bestowed from on high, raises us above all the earthly pinnacles which sway in this inconstant age. For the King and founder of this city of which we are resolved to speak has revealed a maxim of the divine law in the scriptures of his people, where it is said, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. But the swollen fancy of the proud-spirited envies even this utterance, which belongs to God, and loves to hear the following words spoken in its own praise, to spare the humble and subdue the proud. Thus, when the nature of the work here undertaken requires us to say something of it, and as occasion arises, we must not pass over in silence the earthly city also, that city which, when it seeks mastery, is itself mastered by the lust for mastery, even though all the nations serve it. Oh, it does have little chapters. Here we go. It sure does. All right, chapter 1. Of the enemies of Christ's name, whom the barbarians spared for Christ's sake during the sack of the city. For it is from this earthly city that the foes against whom the city of God must be defended come forth. Many of these foes have, indeed, become honorable enough citizens of the city of God, with the error of their ungodliness has been corrected. Many, however, still burn fiercely against her with the fires of hatred, and are ungrateful to her Redeemer for his manifest blessings. They forget that they would not be able to wag their tongues against her today had they not, when fleeing from the enemy's steel, found in her sacred places the lives in which they take such pride. Have not even those Romans whom the barbarians spared for Christ's sake become enemies of Christ's name? The shrines of the martyrs and the churches of the apostles are our witnesses. For during the sack of the city, they sheltered those who fled to them, both their own people and strangers. Thus far the bloodthirsty foe raged, but no farther. There, his savage fury acknowledged its limit, and those of the enemy who were merciful conducted thither those whom they had spared, lest others who did not possess a similar mercy might fall upon them. Indeed, whenever those savage men, who elsewhere raged in the usual fashion of an enemy, came to the place where what the rules of war would have permitted elsewhere was forbidden, all the ferocity with which they smote was curbed, and their greed for captives subdued. In this way, many escaped, who now bewail these Christian times, and impute to Christ the ills which the city suffered. But the good which they received when in honor of Christ they were permitted to live, this they impute not to Christ, but to their own fate. If they had any right perception, they would rather attribute the bitter and harsh things which they endured at their enemies' hands to divine providence. For divine providence often corrects and destroys the corrupt ways of men by wars, and tests the righteous and praiseworthy by such afflictions of this mortal life, either conveying them to a better world when they had been proved, or detaining them still on this earth for further service. Moreover, they ought to attribute it to these Christian times that, contrary to the usage of war, the cruel barbarians spared them in the name of Christ, either anywhere at all or in those places, the broadest of places, chosen to contain great multitudes, so that the mercy might be bestowed more largely, explicitly dedicated to Christ's name. They ought, therefore, to give thanks to God. They ought now to flee to his name in truth, in order to escape the punishment of eternal fire, seeing that so many of them, made use of that name falsely, in order to escape the pains of the immediate rout. For among those whom you now see insolently and shamelessly insulting the servants of Christ are many who would not have escaped that ruin and disaster had they not feigned to be servants of Christ themselves. Now, and thou, with ungrateful pride and most ungodly folly, they oppose his name in their impurity of heart, and so incur the punishment of eternal darkness, who once flew to that name with lying countenance, so that they might enjoy a passing light. Wow, wow. Chapter 2. And in no wars ever before recorded have the victors spared the vanquished for the sake of their gods, small g. Many histories have been composed of the wars raged both before Rome was founded and after her rise and ascension to imperial power. Let our adversaries read these histories and produce any instance of a city captured by invaders where the enemies who seized it spared those whom they found taking refuge in the temples of their gods, small g. Or let them produce an instance of any barbarian lord who commanded that when a town was entered, no one should be smitten who was found in this temple or that. Did not Aeneas see Priam before the altars drenched with blood, the fires that he himself had blessed? Did not Diomedes and Ulysses slay the guardians of the topmost citadel, seize the sacred image, and with bloody hands dare to touch the fillets of the virgin goddess? No. Moreover, are the words which come after these true, that henceforth the hope of the Greeks dwindled and passed away? For even after this they conquered. After this they destroyed Troy with fire and sword, and it was after this that they hewed down Priam as he sought sanctuary at the altars. Nor was it because she lost Minerva, that Troy perished, for what had Minerva herself lost first, that she was unable to prevent Troy from perishing. Her guards, perhaps? Exactly so. For when these were slain, she could be stolen. It was not, therefore, the men who were protected by the effigy, but the effigy by the man. Why was she worshipped then? So that she might defend the fatherland and its people. She who could not manage to defend even her own guards? Question mark. Chapter 3, how imprudent the Romans were in believing that they might derive any benefit from the gods, small g, who could not protect Troy. Behold the manner of gods they were to whom the Romans were pleased to entrust the protection of the city. Explanation point. Oh, too great and miserable error! Explanation point. They are angry with us when we say such things about their gods, small g. Yet they are not angry with their own authors, to whom they paid a fee to teach them such things! Exclamation point. Indeed, they deemed those very teachers entirely worthy to receive a public stipend and honor and other honors. Stipend? Stipend. In the works of Virgil, who is read by small boys precisely so, when their minds are steeped in this great and most famous and best of all poets, he may not easily be abolished into forgetfulness. As Horace says, new vessels long retain the taste of what they first contained. In the works of this Virgil, then, Juno is introduced as hostile to the Trojans, and as inciting against them Ilios, king of the winds, saying, "A people hateful to me now sails the Tyrrhenian sea, bearing Ilium and her vanquished gods to Italy." Small g. Was it prudent, then, thus to entrust Rome, lest she be vanquished, to these vanquished gods? Small g and question mark. But perhaps this Juno spoke as an angry woman, not knowing what she did. What of Aeneas himself, then so often called the pious? Question mark. Does he not speak as follows? Pantheus, Orthes' son, priest of the Cydle, and of Phoebus, bearing in his hand the vanquished god, small g, and dragging his little grandson, come running to my door, besides himself? Question mark. Aeneas, too, therefore, does not hesitate to say that the gods, small g, were vanquished. And is it not clear that the gods, small g, were rather entrusted to him than he to them, when it is said to him, Troy commends her sacred objects and her gods, small g, to you? Question mark. What, I don't know what, sometimes they put these question marks in and it doesn't make any sense. I'm kind of wondering if we put question marks in the wrong places, because a lot of these old books I've been reading, they have question marks in very peculiar places, like it's not even a question. I don't know. I don't understand it. But anyway, Virgil then speaks thus of the gods. He says that they were vanquished and commended to a man so that, though vanquished, they might somehow escape. Is it not madness, therefore, to suppose that Rome could wisely have been entrusted to such protectors, and that she would not have been sacked had she not lost them? Question mark. On the contrary, to worship vanquished gods as rulers and defenders, what is this but to hold fast not to good deities, but to bad omens? Question mark. How much wiser to believe not that Rome would have avoided that disaster had the gods not perished first, but rather that the gods themselves would have perished long before had not Rome protected them for as long as she could. I'm sorry, that's funny. Exclamation point. For who, when he directs his attention to the matter, does not see how vain it is to suppose that she could be conquered while under vanquished defenders, and that she therefore perished because she lost the gods who were her guardians? Question mark. In truth, the only cause of her perishing was that she chose to have guardians who could themselves perish. When they wrote and sang of vanquished gods, therefore, the poets were not mere lying to serve their own purposes. Rather, they were men of intelligence, whom truth had compelled to make confession. But it will be more appropriate to treat of these matters carefully and fully in another place. For the time being, I shall set out, as well as I can, that I have undertaken to say of those ungrateful men who blasphemously impute to Christ the evil which they deserve to suffer by reason of their own moral wickedness. The fact that even such as these were spared by Christ's sake, they do not condescend to notice, and in the madness of their blasphemous wickedness, they exercise their tongues against his name. They exercise those very tongues which they use that name falsely, so that they might live. Those tongues which, in the places consecrated to him, they restrained in terror. Then they were kept safe and protected in a place where, thanks to him, they were unharmed by their enemies. Yet now they burst forth from that sanctuary as enemies, cursing him. Wow. Chapter 4. Of the sanctuary of Juno in Troy, which freed no one from the Greeks, and the churches of the apostles, which protected all who sought refuge in them from the barbarians. As I have said, Troy herself, the mother of the Roman people, was not able to protect her own citizens in the places consecrated to her gods from the fire and steel of the Greeks, who themselves worship those same gods. Rather, indeed, in Juno's sanctuary, the chosen guards, Phoenix and the fell of Ulysses, kept watch over the spoils. Here, at every hand, the Trojan treasurer, stripped from the burning shrines and altars of the gods, bowls of solid gold and looted finery are brought together. Great crowds of boys and fearful women stand about. The place consecrated to so great a goddess, then, was chosen not so that not one might lawfully be led out of its captive, but so that captives might be imprisoned in at pleasure. Compare now that sanctuary, not the sanctuary of one of the common or vulgar mob of gods, but of the queen of all the gods, the sister and wife of Jupiter himself, with the memorial shrines of our apostles. Into the former were carried spoils stripped from the burning temples of the gods, not to be returned to the vanquished, but to be divided up among the victors. Into the latter, the possession of the vanquished, even though found elsewhere, were brought back with honor and with conscientious scruple. In the former, liberty was lost. In the latter, preserved. In the former, bondage was enforced. In the latter, prescribed. In the former, men were forced into slavery as the property of the enemies who had overcome them. In the latter, they were conducted to freedom by the merciful. Finally, the temple of Juno was chosen by the fickle and insignificant Greeks as the scene of avarice and pride. But the churches of Christ were chosen even by the monstrous barbarian as places of mercy and humility. Perhaps, though, the Greeks did, after all, in that victory of theirs, spare the temples of the gods whom they shared with the Trojans. Perhaps they did not dare to smite or enslave the miserable and defeated Trojans who took refuge in them. Perhaps, after the fashion of poet, Virgil had misled us? No. On the contrary, he has depicted the usual custom of an enemy when sacking a city. Chapter 5. Of the account with Cato gives of the universal custom of an enemy when sacking a city. For as Sallust, a historian noted for his veracity, writes, Cato himself did not omit to mention this custom in the speech which he delivered to the Senate concerning the conspirators. Maidens and boys are violated, children plucked from the embrace of their parents. The mothers of families endured whatever might be the pleasure of the victors. Temples and houses are despoiled. There is slaughter and burning. In short, all is filled with arms, corpses, slaughter, and lamentation. Had he here made no mention of the temples, we might have concluded that the enemy was disposed to spare the seats of the gods. Yet the Roman temples had cause to fear these horrors, not from alien foes, but from Catiline and his accomplices, most distinguished senators and Roman citizens. These, however, were plainly abandoned men and the parricides of their fatherland. 6. That not even the Romans, when they captured cities, spared the vanquished in their temples. But why need our account review of the many nations which have waged with one another and never spared the vanquished in the seats of the gods? Let us consider the Romans themselves. Let us, I say, recollect those very Romans who in high praise are said to spare the humble and subdue the proud, and who preferred rather to forgive than to avenge a wrong. As their dominion grew broader, the Romans stormed and captured and overthrew many great cities. Let them tell us, then, what temples they were accustomed to exempt to ensure that any who sought sanctuary there might be free. Did they do this, perhaps, but the writers of their annals say nothing of it? Would those writers who with such great zeal sought things to praise omit to mention what they themselves would have regarded as instances of outstanding piety? Marcus Marcellus, the esteemed Roman personage who captured the splendid city of Syracuse, is said to have wept before its fall, and to have shed his own tears before he shed its blood. Also, he took care to preserve the modesty even of his enemy. For before the victor gave the command to enter the city, he issued an order that no free person was to be violated. The city was, however, overthrown according to the custom of war. Nowhere do we read that this most chaste and clement commander gave instruction that anyone who took refuge in this temple, or that should remain unmolested, and the certainty would not have been omitted by writers who could not pass over in silence either his weeping or his edict that modesty was not to be outraged. Fabius, conqueror of the city of Terratinum, is praised for having abstained from looting its images. Indeed, when his scribe raised with him the question of what he wished done with the many images of the gods which had been captured, he even flavored his restraint with a joke, for he asked of what kind they were, and when word was brought to him that many of them were not only large but armed, he said, "Let us leave those fearsome gods to the Tartatines." Since, therefore, the authors of the Roman annals could not refrain from mentioning either the weeping of the one or the laughter of the other, neither the former's chaste mercy nor the latter's humorous restraint would they omit to mention it if these commanders had shown such forbearance to any men in honor of their gods as to forbid slaughter or captivity in any temple. So they did not. They didn't. Number 7, that the cruelties which occurred during the sack of Rome were in accordance with the customs of war, whereas the act of clemency which took place arose from the power of Christ's name. Therefore, whatever devastation, slaughter, looting, burning, and affliction was committed during the most recent calamity at Rome, all this was at any rate done according to the customs of war. What set a new and unprecedented standard in such affairs, however, was that the savage barbarians appeared under an aspect so gentle that the most captious churches were chosen and set aside by them to be filled with the people who were spared. These churches were places in which no man was to be smitten, whence no man was to be dragged into, which many were led by their merciful enemies in order to be set free, and hence none were led away into captivity by cruel foes. Whoever does not see that this is to be attributed to the name of Christ and to the Christian age is blind. Whoever sees it but does not praise it is ungrateful. Whoever would begrudge such praise is mad. God forbid that any prudent man should impute this merely to the ferocious barbarians, for their minds, utterly savage and utterly cruel, were dismayed, bridled, and miraculously tempered by him, who long ago said through the prophet, "I will visit their transgressions with the rod, and their iniquity with stripes. Nevertheless, my loving kindness will I not utterly take away from them." Chapter 8. Of the advantages and disadvantages which are for the most part common to both good men and bad. Some will say, but why did the divine mercy extend even to the wicked and ungrateful? What are we to suppose, except that it was held out by him who daily maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust? Some, reflecting upon this, have repented of their ungodliness and reformed themselves. Others, however, have, as the apostles say, despised the riches of God's goodness and his forbearance by reason of their hardness of heart and their impenitent heart. These have treasured up for themselves wrath against the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to every man according to his deeds. Nevertheless, the forbearance of God invites the wicked to repent, just as the chastisement of God teaches forbearance to the good. So, too, the mercy of God embraces the good to cherish them, just as God's severity seizes. I got to turn page. The wicked to punish them. It has pleased the divine providence to prepare for the righteous in the world to come good things which will not be enjoyed by the unrighteous, and punishments for the ungodly with which the good will not be tormented. He has, however, willed that the good and evil things of this world should be common to both, so that we may neither grasp too eagerly after those goods which are seen to be possessed by the wicked also, nor dishonorably flee those evils with which even the good are generally afflicted. Also of the highest importance here is the use made both of those things which are deemed fortunate and those which are called adverse. For the good man is neither buoyed up by the good things of this world, nor cast down by its ills, whereas the wicked man, because he is corrupted by good fortune, experiences misfortune of this kind of his punishments. Nevertheless, God often clearly shows himself to be at work even in the distribution of good and bad fortune. For plainly, if every man were visited now with evident punishment, nothing would be reserved for the last judgment. On the other hand, if no sin were punished now by a clearly divine intervention, it would be believed that there is no divine providence. So, too, in the case of prosperity. If God did not grant it to some who pray as the clearest possible proof of his bounty, we should say that such things are not his to give. On the other hand, if he were to grant it to all who pray, we would judge such things to be no more than the due reward of our service, and such service would make us not godly, but rather greedy and covetous. Although this is so, however, the good and the wicked are not themselves without differences, merely because in those cases where they are afflicted equally, there is no difference in what they both suffer. For the dissimilarity of the sufferers remain even where there is a similarity in what they undergo. And even though they suffer the same torment, virtue and vice are nonetheless not the same. In the same fire, gold glows like chaff smokes, and under the same flail straw is crushed and grain purified. Nor is the oil of the olive mingled with the lees, because extracted under the weight of the same press. By the same token, when one and the same force falls upon the good and the wicked, the former are purged and purified, but the latter damned, ruined, and destroyed. Hence it is that under the same affliction the wicked hate and blaspheme God, while the good pray and praise him. What is important, then, is not what is suffered, but by whom. For stirred up by the same motion, mud gives forth a dreadful smell, yet ointment has a sweet fragrance. This could make me cry. Wow. Huh. Chapter 9. Of the reasons why correction is inflicted upon the good and the wicked equally. Bearing these things carefully in mind, therefore, what did the Christians suffer in that time of devastation that would not serve rather to raise them up than harm them? First, let them reflect humbly upon those very sins by reason of which God in his anger has filled the world with such calamities. For though they are very far from being shameful and ungodly criminals, they still do not find themselves so entirely unacquainted with fault as to judge themselves undeserving even of temporal penalties for their misdeeds. Let us leave aside the fact that each man, no matter how praiseworthy his life may be, succumbs now and then to bodily lust. No doubt he does not fall into dreadful crimes and the depths of shame and the abomination of ungodliness, but at least he commits some sins either rarely or, in the case of lesser sins, so much the more frequently. Leaving this aside, however, is there anyone, pray, who treats as they should be treated those very persons on account of those horrible pride, luxury, avarice, and execrable wickedness and impiety? God, as he warned long ago, now smites the earth. Is there anyone whose lives among them as a life lived among such people ought to be? Did I say that right? Is there anyone whose life among them is as a life lived among such people ought to be? For often do we ignore the duty of teaching and admonishing, and sometimes even of rebuking and correcting sinners. We do this either when we weary of the effort or when we hesitate to offend their dignity, or because we wish to avoid enmities which might impede and injure us in respect of some temporal thing which either our greed still desires to obtain or our infirmity fears to lose. So is, then, that even though the lives of wicked men are displeasing to the good, so that the good do not fall with them into the damnation which is prepared for the wicked after this life. Nonetheless, because they are lenient towards the damnable sins of the wicked, the good are justly scourged alongside them in this world, even though their own sins are light and venial, and even though they certainly do not deserve to suffer eternal punishment. It is right that they should have bitterness in this life when they are afflicted by God in common with the wicked. For because they loved the sweetness of this life, they neglected to be bitter to the wicked. If anyone refrains from rebuking and correcting evildoers because he is waiting for a mere propitious time, or for fear of making matters worse by doing so, or because he fears that, if he does so, others who are weak may be discouraged from living a good and godly life and driven and turned away from the faith. This restraint is clearly occasioned not by greed, but by the counsel of love. It is blameworthy, however, when men who live differently from the wicked and abhor their deeds none the less spare the sins of others when they ought to reform and reprove them. It is blameworthy, that is, when they do this for fear of offending persons who might injure them in respect of things which good men may, indeed, lawfully and innocently use, but which they are using more greedily than they should, given that they are pilgrims in this world, bearing with them the hope of a heavenly country. Many Christians are, of course, weaker men who live a married life, who have or wish to have children, who have houses and families. It is to these that the apostles speak in the churches, teaching them how they should live and admonishing them. Wives with husbands and husbands with wives, children with parents and parents with children, servants with masters and masters with servants. And these, because they take pleasure in acquiring many temporal goods and many earthly things, are afraid to lose these things. But it is not only persons of this kind who do not dare to offend even those whose lives, utterly foul and depraved, displease them. On the contrary, even those who embrace a higher order of life, who are not entangled in the bonds of matrimony, or who are not moderate in their use of food and raiment, often abstain from chiding the wicked. They do so because they fear the treacheries of the wicked and their assaults on their reputation and well-being. Thus, though they do not fear them so greatly that any threats or wickedness whatsoever would induce them to commit similar offenses themselves, they are nonetheless unwilling to rebuke crimes that they would not join with the wicked in committing. They are reluctant to do so, even though the rebukes might correct others, lest, if such correction prove impossible, their own well-being and reputation should encounter peril or destruction. And this is not because they consider their well-being and reputation to be necessary to secure the instruction of others. Rather, it is because of a weakness which loves a flattering tongue and human praise, and fears the judgments of the vulgar and the hurt or destruction of the body. It is, in short, because of certain ties of selfishness, and not the offices of love. This seems to me, therefore, no small part of the reason why good and wicked men are afflicted alike when it pleases God to punish abandoned morals with the infiltration of temporal penalties. For both are afflicted together, not because they lead a wicked life together, but because they love this present life. They love it, not equally, indeed, but together nonetheless. Whereas the good ought to despise it, so that the wicked, rebuked and corrected, may attain to eternal life. If, however, the wicked refuse to be their companions in attaining it, let them be born and loved as enemies. For as long as they live, it will always be uncertain whether their minds will not be changed for the better. The position of laymen who do not readily rebuke the wicked is not as bad as that of the clergy, to whom, through the prophet, it is said, "He shall die in his sin, but his blood I shall require at the watchman's hand." The latter's is a much graver case, because the watchmen, that is, those who are set over the people, have been appointed. Well, they better be anointed too, huh? Have been appointed in the churches precisely so that they may not be lenient in rebuking sins. Nor, however, is that man free from guilt of this kind, who, even though he is not set over them, nonetheless notices many sins deserving of admonition and reproof in the people with whom he is associated by the necessities of this life, yet ignores them. Who ignores them because he is who ignores them because he is afraid of giving offense, and for the sake of those things which it is not unworthy to use in this life, but which is unworthy to love so much. Then again, there is another reason why the good are afflicted with temporal evils, as in the case of Job, so that the human spirit may be tested in itself, and the great strength of its piety known, by which it loves God even without reward. Wow. Chapter 10. That the saints suffer no loss in losing temporal things. Having duly considered and investigated these things, then, let us now turn to the question of whether any evil has befallen the faithful and godly that has not turned to their good. Or are we to conclude that the utterance of the apostle was in vain when he said, "We know that all things work together for good to them that love God"? They lost all they had, their faith, their godliness, the goods of an inward man who is rich before God. These are the riches of the Christians, of which the great apostle spoke. But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some covet after, they have erred from the faith, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Those who lost earthly riches in the sack, therefore, if they had held those in the manner of which they had heard, as one poor without, but rich within, that is, if they had made use of the world as if not using it, would have been able to say, with one sorely tempted, yet never conquered, "Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return into the earth. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. As it pleased the Lord, so has it come to pass. Blessed be the name of the Lord." As a good servant, Job held the will of his Lord to be a great treasure in itself, through attendance upon which his spirit should grow rich. Nor was he saddened to lose in life those things which he would in any case shortly lose in death. But those weaker Christians who, even though they did not prefer these earthly goods to Christ, nonetheless clung to them with no small desire, discovered in losing them how much they had sinned in loving them. For they grieved in proportion as, excuse me, in the words of the apostle quoted above, they had pierced themselves through with many sorrows. For it was fitting that the lesson of experience should be added to those who had for so long neglected the lesson of speech. When the apostle says that they will be rich, fall into temptation, and so on, he is in truth condemning not the possession of riches, but greed for them. For speaking elsewhere, he teaches, charge them that are rich in this world, that they be not high-minded, nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who giveth us richly all things to enjoy, that they do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute, willing to communicate, laying up in store for themselves a good foundation against the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life. Those who made such use of the riches are consoled, for light loses by great gains. They are more gladdened by those spiritual things which they have preserved all the more securely by freely giving of their earthly goods, than saddened by the loss of those things which they would have lost anyway, even had they fearfully withheld them. For they could lose nothing on earth save that which they would be ashamed to carry away from it. They heeded the counsel of God, who said to them, lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break in, or break through, and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. They have proved in time of tribulation how wise they were in despising the truest teacher, that most faithful and undoubtful guardian of their treasures. Many men indeed rejoiced that they had laid up their earthly treasures in a place where, as it happened, the enemy did not break through. How much more certainly and securely, though, were those able to rejoice by the counsel of God had betaken themselves to that place where the enemy could not possibly break through. My friend Paulinus, Bishop of Nola, is a man who willingly abandoned immense wealth and become exceedingly poor, yet abundantly holy. I learned from him afterwards, when the barbarians sacked Nola itself, that he was held captive by them. He used to pray in his heart, O Lord, let me not be tortured for the sake of gold and silver, but for thou knowest where all my treasures are. He kept all his goods where he had been counseled to hoard and treasure them up by him who had foretold that these evils would come to pass in the world. In any case, those who obeyed the Lord when he taught them where and how they should lay up their treasures did not lose even their earthly riches when the barbarians' invasion came. By contrast, those who now regret that they did not obey have learned the right use of such things, if not by the wisdom which would have forestalled their loss, at least by the experience which has followed it. Again, some good and Christian men were subjected to torture in order to make them surrender their goods to the enemy. But these could neither betray nor lose that good by which they were themselves made. Also, if they preferred to be tortured rather than forsake the mammon of unrighteousness, they were not good. Rather, those who suffered as much for gold as they ought to have suffered for Christ should have been moved by this to learn to love him. They should have learned to love him who enriches those who suffer for him with eternal felicity, rather than gold and silver, for which, whether they concealed themselves by lying or relinquished them by truth-telling, it was wholly worthless to suffer. For no one lost Christ by confessing him under torture, and no one saved their gold other than by denying him. Perhaps then the torturers were taught them to love an incorruptible good, were of more benefit to them than goods whose love brought torture upon their heads without any valuable fruit. But there were certain others who, even though they had nothing to hand over, were tortured because they were not believed. Perhaps, however, these persons were greedy to possess. Perhaps, though poor, they were not so by a holy act of will. To these, then, it was necessary to demonstrate that not only wealth, but even the desire for it, is worthy of such tortures. And even if they had no hidden store of gold and silver, because they had resolved to lead a better life, I do not know if there were any such to whom it happened that they were tortured in the belief that they had wealth. But even if this did happen, he who under those tortures confessed holy poverty surely confessed Christ. For this reason, even if he did not succeed in making his enemies believe him, the confessor of holy poverty could not be tortured without a heavenly reward. They say that many persons, including Christians, were laid low by the protracted famine. This also, however, the good and faithful turned to right use by bearing it with godliness. For those whom the famine slew, it rescued from the ills of this life, as does bodily sickness. And those whom it did not slay, it taught to live more moderately. It taught them to fast more diligently. Chapter 11. Of the end of this temporal life, and whether it matters if it comes later or sooner. But many Christians were slaughtered, and many were consumed by a great variety of dreadful deaths. If this is hard to bear, however, it is at any rate common to all who have been born into this life. I know this, that no one has ever died who had not been going to die eventually. The end of life makes a long life the same as a short one, for the one is not better than the other, worse, and the other worse, and the one is not greater and the other lesser, when both no longer exist. But what does it matter what kind of death has put an end to this life, as long as he whose life has ended is not compelled to die a second time? And when, under the daily contingencies of this life, every mortal man is, so to speak, threatened with innumerable deaths, and it is uncertain which one of them will overtake him, is it, I ask, better to suffer one and die, or to live and fear them all? I do not overlook the fact that a man would rather live long and fear many deaths than die once and dread none of them after. But it is one thing to consider death as something that the fearful instinct of the flesh seeks in its infirmity to flee from, and another to contemplate it carefully with the reason of the mind. Death is not to be deemed an evil when a good life precedes it, nor is death made an evil except by what follows death. Therefore, those who are of necessity bound to die need not care greatly by what means they will eventually die, but into what place they will be brought by dying. Since then, Christians know how much better was the death of the godly pauper, licked by the tongues of the dogs, than that of the impious rich man, clad in purple and fine linen. What harm did those terrible deaths do to the dead, and who had lived well? Chapter 12. Of the burial of men's bodies, and that Christians lose nothing even if burial be denied. Moreover, so great was that massacre that not all the bodies of the dead could be buried. A godly faith, however, does not much shrink from this fact, holding fast to the assurance that not even the ravening beast will injure the bodies of those who are to rise again, and that not a hair of their heads will perish. If anything that the foe had chosen to do to the bodies of the dead might be harmful to their future life, the truth certainly would not have said, "Fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul." Perhaps, however, someone is foolish enough to argue that, on the one hand, those who slay the body are not to be feared before death, lest they slay the body, but that, on the other hand, they are to be feared after death, lest they will not permit the body, now slain, to be buried. What Christ says is false, then. Be not afraid of them that kill the body, and after that have no more that they can do. If they can, after all, do such great harm to our corpses, God forbid that what the truth has said should be thought false! Exclamation point. Those who kill the body are said to have accomplished something only because there is a sensation in the body that they kill it. Afterwards, however, they have nothing that they can do, because there is no sensation in a dead body. There are, then, many Christian bodies not covered by the earth, but no one has separated them from heaven, nor from the earth, which is wholly filled with the presence of him who knows whence he will raise that which he has created. It is indeed said in the psalm, "The dead bodies of thy servants have they given to be meat unto the fowls of the heaven, the flesh of thy saints unto the beasts of the earth. Their blood have they shed like water round about Jerusalem, and there was none to bury them." This, however, was said in order to give emphasis to the cruelty of those who did these things, rather than to the misery of those who suffered them. For though in the sight of men these things may seem hard and dire, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. Therefore, the care bestowed upon the ceremony of burial, the place of interment, the procession of mourning, all these things are done more to comfort the living than to aid the dead. If a costly burial were of any benefit to the ungodly, then a cheap one, or none at all, would harm the godly. His retinue of servants furnished for the purple-clad Dives a funeral magnificent in the sight of men, but far more glorious in the sight of God, was that given to the poor man with his sores by the angels who bore him not to a marble tomb, but to the bosom of Abraham. Those against whom I have undertaken the defense of the city of God laugh at these things, but even their own philosophers deem it contemptible to bestow care upon a funeral. And often whole armies, as they died for the soil of their fathers, cared not where they were to lie afterwards, or for what beast they might be food. In this manner, we applaud the poets when they say, "His covering is the sky, who has no urn." Our adversaries, therefore, have no reason to make unburied bodies an occasion for mocking the Christians. For the Christians have been promised that this fallen flesh shall be restored not only from the earth, but from the most secret heart of the other elements into which it has passed, that it shall be given back and made whole in a moment of time. Praise God. Yep. I had a person come and try to sell me, I don't know what it's called, life insurance, death insurance, or something like that. I don't know what it's called. And I said, no, it's all right. And they're like, yeah, but what about your burial? I said, you know what? They can dig a hole in the backyard and throw me in it. I could care less because I'm not going to know anything about it. I told my children, I don't want no dinner or anything like that. I'm not even going to be there. And my son was like, Mom, it's not for you. It's for us. It's like, well, you do what you will. When I pass away, I will not know anything about it. So anyway, guys, that concludes that part, and I will pick up. I will probably focus more on this today, and then maybe tomorrow, Martyr's Mirror. I'm not positive. We'll see. Okay. So next time, we will pick up in chapter 13. Until then, keep your eyes on Jesus, brothers and sisters, and your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And let us embed the Word of God on the tablets of our hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived.